I could have forgotten, and I should have just talked to Cynthia. Well, they're leaving this afternoon to go to Seattle for lunch. And I'll be back on Friday. So, safe travels.
They gonna get to see their grandson while they're over there? Granddaughter.
Granddaughter, yeah.
The grandson's here, the granddaughter is over there.
Well,
Exodus chapter 12. We'll be beginning in verse 42, and we'll read through the end of the chapter. It is a night to be observed for the Lord, for having brought them out from the land of Egypt. This night is for the Lord, to be observed by all the sons of Israel throughout their generations. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner is to eat of it, but every man's slave purchased with money, after you have circumcised him, then he may eat of it. A sojourner or hired servant shall not eat of it. It is to be eaten in a single house. You are not to bring forth any of the flesh outside of the house, nor are you to break any bone of it. All the congregation of Israel are to celebrate this. But if a stranger sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near to celebrate it. And he shall be like a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person may eat of it. The same law shall apply to the native as to the stranger who sojourns among you." Then all the sons of Israel did so. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that same day, the Lord brought the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. Okay. That's the end of the chapter. Amazingly enough, we've arrived. So, what do we think about it?
I guess the one question I would have in verse 44 and further on to it talks about this, that every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. But does that slave mean, doesn't say, Jew or Israel person, but could it be any? As long as it was a member of the household, that slave was a member, if they were circumcised, they could partake of it.
Okay. Well, we haven't gotten to the laws around slavery yet. We will be getting to them before too long. Certainly, if you bought a Jewish person, a Jewish male into slavery, they would be there for a time and not perpetually. And they would presumably also already be circumcised. So they're Jewish and therefore included into the mix. If you buy a Gentile slave, I guess the presumption would be that you were buying him for life. And therefore he is now part of your, I'm sure he could be redeemed. That would be a possibility. Maybe he can redeem himself. But he would be part of your household and I guess would then also be circumcised.
Seems like as you think of this, as I do anyway, I'm going through this, I'm thinking specifically about the Israel people themselves, not anybody else, whereas this kind of, to me, says that there are other, besides Jews, that are Israelites that are involved in this. That never did be before.
Well, the nation will not simply be made up of Hebrews, ethnic Jews. That's no nation has total ethnic purity, I guess you would say. And Israel will be drawing people in. I didn't look it up. If somebody wants to look it up, that'd be great. Solomon's prayer of dedication of the temple. The temple is supposed to be a beacon of hope to the nations, not simply to Israel, but to whoever sees it, looks up to it, sees it, and therefore can rejoice in it and feel the presence of God and find hope in relationship with God, therefore, from it. But it is a Jewish institution. The Passover is the Jewish story. It is how God redeemed Israel from Egyptian slavery. But it doesn't stay completely Jewish. In a way it does, because it's always their story. But in a way, the love God is showing here to his favored nation will attract people from diverse backgrounds, and you are perfectly welcome to sojourn in Israel without being circumcised, without joining the nation. But that means you cannot observe Passover. You're not going to be going into what is later built as the temple or even the tabernacle. You're a second-class citizen, if you want to say it that way. But those who are circumcised now are welcomed into the community. And we didn't talk about, of course, because the circumcision of Israel was only a male circumcision. They didn't practice any female circumcision, which is practiced still in a lot of parts of the world today, and usually in a horrific manner, actually. But the female slaves, you brought up slavery, we'll kind of look at it later on, whether they're Jewish or Gentile. The Jewish male slaves were served for 6 years and were released. The female slaves were slaves perpetually, even if they were Jewish. So once again, they might be able to be redeemed or something like that. Somebody could maybe buy them, but they were not subject to the opportunity to be automatically liberated after a period of time. So we'll look into that kind of stuff later on when we get to the laws. And it's troubling, but probably still a form of compassion, really. So depends on how you look at it, all these things. So
The very first Passover that they're talking about now, they were talking about the uncircumcised then, and the slaves, the Israelites were all slaves of Egypt, but they bought slaves too.
that is possible. My own slaves. I mean, if you the complexity of the social situation, but the writing, we've talked about it a little bit, imagines the institution of the Passover, it remembers what God did the first through the 10th plague, the first Passover, but it also anticipates what God will do for Israel. And we'll look at that more in chapter 13. Anticipates what God will do. And those who observe subsequent Passovers are theologically included in the community that went through the first Passover, experienced the first Passover. So they're tied across time and space. It doesn't matter where they are or when they are. If they are observing a Passover according to God's requirements, then they are a part of that community of the first Passover participants. So it does matter kind of on a historical authenticity thing, but it doesn't matter theologically to the people. But yes, I guess it's possible at least. I mean, if you're in slavery and you need to buy your way out, I mean, you think your money would go to buying yourself out rather than buying other slaves. But who knows what all complexities had arranged by that point. So, because there may be different levels of slavery and different forms of it and everything. We have our horrible history of slavery with America, and but not all slavery throughout human history was identical to that. So,
is there, I don't know, in talking about this at this particular point in Exodus, and I've heard people say this before, and I don't know, I've never found a place, but is there any indication that there were any people other than the Israelites who came out of Egypt with them?
Came out with them.
Yeah, were there any Egyptians who, as a result of the plagues,
Well, I think
you know?
my understanding of the secular history at the time is that Egyptian secular history doesn't mention this at all, which isn't too surprising, because it's, you don't really write about your losses historically. The history is written by the winners. So Israel's emancipation would not have been something Egypt wanted to commemorate. There are some, my understanding again of the Egyptian secular history mentions something about Semitic people coming into Egypt that would kind of coincide with Joseph's story in the Bible, the biblical story of Joseph, and even acquiring power and being very influential. So there is maybe some secular history in support of that. I don't know of any secular history that would say that Israel brought other groups out with them through this form of emancipation. Certainly the biblical narrative is specific and intended to be specific to Israel. This is going to be something they bring up over and over and over again, that God brought you up out of Egypt when you were a slave. So this is a touchstone moment for their national identity, their history, and it is also something that crosses, the lines that kind of Western 21st century people have of politics, church, daily life, social. It's all of that. There's no separation between what we sometimes call the sacred and the profane, the holy and the common. This is God moving everything, in a sense, at this point is around and tied into their religion. Yes, sir. Your wife is online too. So hello, Robin.
1238, 37 Israelites journeyed. There was about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them,
Okay.
as well as large droves of livestock and stuff. And what did yours say?
Mixed.
Mixed multitude. Okay.
Yeah.
They may have had some slaves, even though they were slaves. The slavery may have been more along the line of like indentured servitude or whatever, where you had your obligations, but they may have acquired some. And they were free at different times. They didn't start out as slaves. So they may have had the descendants of the slaves that they brought with them to Egypt to begin with. So that's a good point. Thank you for bringing that. The mixed multitude, I don't know exactly what that meant, but it likely means kind of the people that were tied to them, however they were connected to them. But you have a big group of people. Again, if it's 600,000 or 2 million, we talked about this last week. It could be that, or it could be possibly 600 clans, 600 extended family units, and even that, you're not going to have just the family. You're going to have people around. We know, though, that they didn't commonly marry the Egyptians. Joseph had an Egyptian wife, but the Egyptians found the Hebrews repugnant. They didn't want anything to do with them. They kept them segregated so that they would form their own specific race through what could be called inbreeding, really, over many generations. But that's, when you start out with a family and you end up with a nation and they're isolated, there's really no other way to reproduce. So, but it was all according to the will of God. So. Any other thoughts anything else you want to bring up on this very important and somewhat lengthy chapter, Exodus chapter 12. Okay. It's a little bit of narrative with a whole lot of religious prescriptions, a lot of ritual surrounding the very minimal narrative. And they are to be kind of understood in conjunction with one another, which is setting us up, I think, pretty good for what we're going to look at here in Exodus chapter 13. So let's get into that and look at verses 1 through 16. We might even get through the whole chapter today. Who knows? Exodus 13, beginning in verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Sanctify to me every firstborn, the first offering of every womb among the sons of Israel, both of man and beast. It belongs to me. Moses said to the people, Remember this day in which you went out from Egypt, from the house of slavery. By a powerful hand the Lord brought you out from this place, and nothing leavened shall be eaten. On this day in the month of Abib you are about to go forth. It shall be when the Lord brings you to the land of Canaanite, the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, which he swore to give your fathers, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall observe this rite in this month. For 7 days you shall not eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten throughout the 7 days, and nothing leavened shall be seen among you, nor shall any leaven be seen among you in all your borders. You shall tell your son on that day, saying, It is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. And it shall serve as a sign to you on your hand, and as a reminder on your forehead, and that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a powerful hand the Lord brought you out of Egypt. Therefore you shall keep this ordinance at its appointed time from year to year. And now when the Lord brings you to the land of the Canaanite, as he swore to you and to your fathers, and gives it to you, you shall devote to the Lord the first offspring of every womb, and the first offspring of every beast that you own. The males belong to the Lord. But every first offspring of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. But if you do not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. And every firstborn of man among your sons, you shall redeem. And that shall be when your son asks you in time to come, saying, What is this? Then you shall say to him, With a powerful hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. And it came about when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrificed to the Lord the males, the first offspring of every womb, but every firstborn of my sons I redeem. So it shall serve as a sign on your hand and as phylacteries to your foreheads. For with a powerful hand the Lord brought us up out of Egypt. Okay. What do we think about that?
Can you talk a little about verse 16? Like my Bible says frontlets between the eyes, and you said something else.
Phylacteries. Those were like ribbons or items that they wore that had things written on them to reflect their faith. Excuse me. You see the practicing, observant, Orthodox, whatever term is accurate to describe them. Jewish people today, particularly the priests, will be wearing very distinctive clothing, and it will have phylacteries. Sometimes they'll have really long sideburns or locks of hair coming down on the side, curled up and everything, and that is an outward manifestation of their religious beliefs. So,
What about do you know anything about the token upon my hand? The start of the verse?
well, they wouldn't have. They might have worn a bracelet or something like that. They wouldn't have tattooed themselves.
I have a footnote here. A literal reading of this verse has led to the practice of writing the text on strips of parchment and placing them in two small leather boxes, which the observer used straps on his forehead and left arm before his morning prayers. Boxes are called the phylacteries. This practice seems to have originated after the exiles of Babylon. So yeah, like Rick said, I've seen, on TV coverage and stuff like that, some of the real strict observers having them things.
I think the ones who go to that length are mostly the priests too. I don't even think practicing. Maybe they do it at a time at home in prayer, but you'll see today not so strictly observant Jews wear yarmulke pretty much all the time, which is a way of symbolizing their Jewishness. So they, it was something that they had to outwardly manifest at all times. Of course, circumcision was an outward manifestation of it. It's the kind of thing we think is very private, and you wouldn't get it checked very often. But if you were in the community, if you stayed in the same town you were born in all the time, they would have remembered. Everybody, all your friends and family would have known that you were or were not circumcised on the 8th day and redeemed. If you were the firstborn male, redeemed as Jesus was redeemed and brought to the temple, that which opens the womb. It's a tremendous amount of ritual. And, Paul had Timothy as a grown man circumcised in his ministry. So somebody was checking, I guess. So I would say mind your own business if they ask me, but that's not what was going on back then. Yes, sir.
The phylacteries are in Matthew 23. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to the disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must obey them, do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is for men to see. They make their phylacteries wide and their tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets. So they were doing that in the New Testament.
Yes, they kept, in fact, their obedience to Torah kind of waxed and waned over the course of Israel's history. But just as you don't see very many people doing it in our context now, if you go over to Israel now, if you go to Jerusalem now, you will see that some of the different priests that have different kind of sects, sects, sorry, and different followings. They're kind of like professional athletes over here. They have followers. They have like trading cards. It's kind of crazy, really, how much they honor the person that they're really. I guess we're kind of crazy with our sports figures, but that's kind of these are their heroes of their culture. So, and a lot of them, especially on the right occasion, will be wearing the full regalia. And it's very clear their habits and clothing and everything are not totally dissimilar from a lot of the Islamic traditions, but they're distinctive. I mean, it is, it's one and not the other pretty much. So they still wear the phylacteries at times, at least, and it's the right people. And they wore them when Jesus was around, and
I'm a little confused about the redeemed.
Okay.
In verse 13, it says, "But every offspring of the donkey you shall redeem the lamb." And it goes on to say, "Every firstborn of man among you shall redeem." Now, you said something about going to the firstborn, or I don't know, maybe all of them. I'm not sure which. But they took the child to the priest on the 8th day, right?
Yes, the mother was, if she had a boy, was impure for 8 days.
Is that the reason the 8 days?
Yes. Or 7 days, I guess. 7 days. So on the 8th day, they would go to the temple. She was impure for a week if she had a boy, 2 weeks if she had a
And then what
girl.
did they do to the child?
Well, they would offer these sacrifices. There's a ceremony around the redemption. He would be circumcised, and it was a way of, in a sense, kind of buying him back from God because he belonged to God. But it's also in the story of Samuel when he's born.
Right.
Remember, his mother Hannah is incapable of conceiving children. She promises to surrender him basically into the priestly profession, and she does that with Samuel when he's old enough to do that. But the whole notion, the whole idea is God gets the first, and that's the story. The overall message of this passage is that the firstborn, the first fruits, whether it's animal, vegetable, or mineral, or human, kind of whatever, when the crops come in, the first crops go to God. When it's the first animal born to a female animal, first male animal born to a female animal, has to be either sacrificed to God. In the case of a donkey, it would be an unclean animal, but a very valuable animal and an important animal to that culture and in the biblical story, in a sense. Jesus enters Jerusalem on the foal of a donkey, so it's an important animal, but not clean. So you couldn't offer the donkey to God, but you can offer a lamb to God to redeem the donkey. And if you're not, I guess there's a lot of times with these laws, there's ways around them, I guess you could say, but they're not very appealing. And I mean, who's going to want to kill their newborn donkey? I mean, that donkey's got a lot of work ahead of it. You're just going to break its neck. So, but it's an abomination to God to not redeem it. It's taking what is God's, the firstborn, and then making it profane, making it common, making it somebody else's. So they're stealing and robbing from God. So you kill it. That donkey didn't do anything wrong, but that's not how they looked at it. So, and I think the main thing of this passage is the message of the priority of God in what Israel receives, that the first things they get belong to God. And that is, in a sense, a shift from the Genesis story, in that so often in Genesis, the first is kind of passed over in favor of a subsequent born child. And that is a surprising aspect of the story sometimes. But Ishmael is the firstborn son to Abraham, but Isaac is the child of faith. Now, different mothers, and certainly Isaac opens the womb of Sarah, but Ishmael comes along first, and Ishmael has status, and Ishmael inherits, and he's not forgotten. Esau is not forgotten, but Jacob is favored. Esau is born first. There's a lot of sons that come along before Joseph shows up, but Joseph is the favored chosen one who doesn't have, that's why we don't have a tribe of Joseph. We have Manasseh and Ephraim, 2 tribes that come out of Joseph. So in the Genesis story, we see kind of God's surprising, not so much rejection, but alternative to the traditional preference shown to the firstborn. in Exodus, he calls Israel his firstborn. In chapter 4, verse 22, he tells Pharaoh, "Let my firstborn Israel go." But in what way is Israel firstborn? I mean, there were a lot of nations before, when you go back through the Genesis story, there's a lot of nations that come along before Israel comes along. There's a lot of nations that have done a lot of great things and really stood out. But Israel is this nation of faith, born out of Jacob, a child of faith. But really, they're the firstborn because God says they're the firstborn. He makes his mind up. He doesn't. He said, "Oh, am I wrong? I didn't call you because you were the greatest of nations. I called you because you were the least of all nations." It is a status that is imputed to them through their faith, by the will and the grace of God. It's not a status or a title they actually have earned or are genetically entitled to. It's simply God's will for them to be the firstborn. Is there anything like that in our faith system?
I'm sorry, anything like what again?
Anything like imputed status to us in our faith system?
On the death of the adult person, the firstborn son is usually the one that gets everything and has to divvy up what the other ones get.
But they would have, yes, under a lot of cultures, and it persists today in the world, throughout the world, and throughout even the Western world to some extent, the preferred status of the eldest child in terms of inheritance. But this idea of imputed status you're not really entitled to, but you're getting anyway.
Okay, that's what I was thinking you were going. Christ, through Christ,
Is-
we have access to the Father. We are given, the status of sons and daughters of God.
We are declared to be righteous,
Right.
not based on our own righteousness,
Right.
but on our faith in the one who is truly righteous. And the righteousness of God, really there's two kinds of righteousness of God, one from God and one of his basic nature. God's basic righteousness is his covenant faithfulness, that God always keeps his promises, that he is the perfect covenant partner. The righteousness from God, the righteousness God gives us, is a righteousness that is given to us by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. Not that we are righteous. There is no one righteous, not even one. But God says you are righteous, and God is the judge. And since he's the judge, if that's his determination, there's no appeal from God. No one, the accuser, Satan, can't go to a higher court because God is the highest court. So the accuser says they're wicked, they're sinful, they don't keep your word. God says you're righteous. And that's the status we get from God. So Israel is the firstborn, not because they're the greatest nation, not because they're the first nation. They are the firstborn because God wills them to be the firstborn. God determines they're the firstborn. God gives them that status. And that's the end of the discussion, really. They are, I guess you could say, in firstborn in the sense that they are the firstborn of faith, because Jacob is born of faith. Isaac is born of faith, rather than what their parents are capable of doing. Abraham and Sarah could not have kids together. Isaac and Rebekah could not have kids together either. Ultimately, Joseph is born after his mother, Rachel, is proven to be infertile for a very long period of time. So this idea of God bringing life out of what is basically an impossible situation happens over and over again. And through that line, that's how God's family of faith comes to be. But what I think I want to make this connection is that since they are not actually the firstborn, they are the firstborn because God says they are. We can all be the firstborn. It doesn't matter when we were born. It matters what God says about when we were born. What's important is not what the birth certificate says. What's important is what God says. And also, it's a painful, bloody process. It's like birth in a sense. Egypt is bearing the labor pains of the birth of the nation of Israel. In a sense, Egypt is Mary. Egypt is the mother of this family. Expelling Israel out of its midst in pain and blood and suffering, Israel comes out with new life. And these are all, religious ideas and concepts and a religious practice, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. We've just had a repetition of the Passover. Here's a repetition of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. They observe the Feast of the Unleavened Bread in context with the consecration of the firstborn. Not just simply Exodus, but specifically the consecration of the firstborn. And you tie that in with the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, which is around the Passover. So this is a very religious significance, religious thing too. And yet it involves real life too, the daily life. Children are born every day. Firstborn children are born every day. And so, again, we'd like to separate and delineate and say, this is what I believe, and this is how I vote, and this is how I live. Or we like to delineate, this is how I make my money. This is what I teach my kids. This is how I treat my wife. These are all separate things. That's not God's intentions for his people. His intentions, the whole thing, this is very holistic. Even though they're talking about the firstborn, which you think would be very specific, there's only one firstborn. And in a way, there is. I mean, when it comes to the actual religious practice, you didn't have to redeem the second, third, fourth, fifth-born, however many kids you have, out of, from the mother. And that's another thing about all this stuff. I mean, it's very much a patriarchy, but when you look at kind of your religious and your relationship with God, what really matters almost more than who your father is who your mother is. Ishmael had the same father as Isaac, but they had different mothers. So who matters the most? But there's this connection with God through that he wants to have throughout our entire lives. And I guess that, to me, the big thing I want to take from that is that there's this real trend and popularity in our culture today to saying, I'm spiritual but not religious. And a lot of the people will say, I really like Jesus, I don't like Christians. And I can kind of understand that sometimes. That's not that hard to comprehend because Jesus is in a book. He's a long way away. He's a character. We see the ideal presentation. He's idealized even beyond the book in the presentation by a lot of people. And you come to Christians and they're everyday folk and they make mistakes and they hurt people just like everyone else does. But if you like Jesus and if you want to be like Jesus, you have to be religious, don't you? And Jesus was religious. Jesus was very religious. Being religious is not a dirty word. There is going to be a disconnect, though, at times between what we believe and what we say and what we teach and what we try to sometimes impose on other people and then what we do ourselves. And Jesus, the passage PD read to us, so Jesus is talking about that they're on the seat of Moses. You got to do what they say, but they bind laws on others. They don't keep themselves. We don't always keep our own precepts, our own teachings, our own laws. Hypocrisy is repulsive to almost everyone. Hypocrisy is present among everyone. We've all been hypocrites at times. We've all pointed to other people and said, you shouldn't be doing that, while we're doing it, or something similar or something worse. That's just kind of part of humanity. But God's attention, it crosses time, and it crosses space. It crosses every aspect, every element of our life. It's not just what we believe while we go to church, but we do go to church. We are religious. We gather with the assembly of other people of faith, other Christians. And we take it on out into the world. And yes, we're all the firstborn. We're all the first fruit. Jesus is the first fruit, but we're the first fruit too. We're supposed to be showing people what it means to be God's people, the redeemed of God's people. If you redeem the firstborn, if the firstborn belongs to God, then if you belong to God, what? You're the firstborn. And not chronologically, not based on what your birth certificate says. I don't know I haven't looked at my birth certificate in a really long time, but the one I have has on there that my mother had a child before she had me. It doesn't have that she was going to have another one after me, but they didn't know that yet. But just as Israel is not the firstborn because they came along the first, they're the firstborn because they're God's chosen people, because God chose them to be firstborn. I'm the firstborn because my parents like me the best. I guess that's not true. they're very even-handed. That was just a bad joke. But I'm the problem middle child, so you can figure where I'm at on the list, I think. But in a sense, these things, when you first look at them, they look very fleshly, I guess is what I would say. This is very much about earthly things. It's about the firstborn specifically. And it's kind of a return to the custom of the world at the time, a departure, if you will, from the stories of Genesis. But at the same time, it's still a very inclusive message. It's a message that when the firstborn is a nation that wasn't the first one around and isn't the greatest nation, in fact, a nation that doesn't even really exist yet. Israel as a nation doesn't exist when God calls them his firstborn. They're just a bunch of Hebrew slaves inside of another. They don't have any national autonomy. They don't have any land. They don't have their own freedom. But they're still God's firstborn. So it just transcends all of the kind of restrictions or delineations we might want to emphasize. It is, again, all these things look back to the Exodus. So they're about memory. You do them where you're at right now. So it's about experience. And you look ahead to the future, what God will do. So it transcends time. It transcends status. It's what God has done, is doing, and will do. It's how we see the world, how we live our lives, and how we look to the future. Okay. We may come back to that and talk about it briefly next week, if you're not already sick of it. But we'll finish up chapter 13 and probably get into chapter 14 next week. So thank you for your attention and your comments. Mr. Cole is going to lead us in a closing.